Alrighty, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to our three panelists for being here today. I'm Katie Posey. I'm a web and media intern for the Division of Humanities and Fine Arts here at UCSB, and I'm excited to be here today. HFA Speaks is an event that the division hosts every quarter, and each quarter we welcome a few of our amazing faculty members here at UCSB to talk about a specific topic. Today's HFA Speaks event, HFA Speaks AAPI Heritage Month, Enriching America, will focus on Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I think the name may have given it away already. And AAPI Heritage Month is an annual celebration that shines light on the cultural and historical contributions of the AAPI community. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them towards the end of the panel. And also before we begin, I'd like to just give a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Chumash people, the traditional custodians of the land on which UCSB was built. So let's get started. First, I'd like to welcome Professor Lisa Sun-Hee Park. Professor Park is a sociology professor here at UCSB. She also teaches Asian American history. Professor Park's research focuses on the politics of migration, race, and social policy. She serves as an editor for a book series, Asian American Experience at the University of Illinois Press. Her most recent book, entitled To Nothing, The Struggle for Immigrant Healthcare in the Age of Welfare Reform, investigates the impact of federal welfare and immigration policies on Latina and Asian immigrant women's healthcare access. It's great to have you here, Professor Park. I'd like to also welcome Professor Yunte Huang. Professor Huang is a professor of English and an award-winning writer. His book, Charlie Chan, The Untold Story of the Honorable Detective and His Rendezvous with American History, won the Edgar Award and was named a New York Times notable book. His research focuses on Asian American and Trans-Pacific literature, as well as 20th century American poetry. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Huang.
Thank you.
Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Tiffany Lytle. Tiffany graduated from UCLA with a master's in Asian American Studies. She's currently a PhD candidate in UCSB's Theater and Dance Department. Tiffany's research focuses on the Cambodian American experience and cultural production. Her essay entitled Cambodian Classical Dance, Authenticity, Effect, and Exclusion is published in a collection by University of Hawaii Press entitled California Dreaming, Movement and Place in the Asian American Imagery. Tiffany's actually attending another panel right after this, so we really appreciate her making a point to be here with us on the same day, and it's great to have you, Tiffany.
Thanks so much for having me, Katie.
Alrighty, so the first question I have for all of you is, can you tell us about your own heritage and how it has influenced the person you are today? And what does this AAPI month mean to you? And Professor Huang, if you can start us off.
Sure. Well, I was born in China, grew up there, and went to college there as well. So, and then came to the United States after college for my graduate studies, and then I got stuck. So in some ways, I'm not the typical Asian American like my children ABCs, but so far I've spent more time in the United States than in China. So I consider myself Chinese and American in some ways. And this month, well, many things have happened this month, actually. Most recently in Buffalo, and I went to graduate school there, and I can say more about it later on as to what happened in Buffalo. Actually, I was very close by on that same day, and I almost went to Buffalo on that day. So there are a lot of things going on, and including, of course, what happened in Dallas and in previous months as well. So something is big. I mean, something is going on, definitely. So I'm glad we can have this panel to discuss all these issues. Thank you.
Definitely. I've been seeing stuff all over the news, and we will definitely get back to that stuff as the discussion goes on. Tiffany?
Yes, so I'm Tiffany. I'm originally from San Pedro, California, and I identify as Cambodian American. I am mixed race, Cambodian American, and I grew up doing Cambodian classical dance on the weekends in Long Beach, California, which is the largest, is space for Cambodian diasporic folks in the United States. And so, going there on the weekends, which was just like 15 minutes away, and then coming back and going to school on the weekdays in San Pedro, I learned like very early on that there were not a lot of Cambodians in San Pedro. And so being Cambodian was very special for me. And when I was in my normal schools, people didn't even know where Cambodia was on a map. So having that identity has most definitely influenced who I am today, and having that experience has as well. But in terms of AAPI Heritage Month, I have really complicated feelings around this, right? On one hand, having an AAPI Heritage Month is really helpful for promoting the visibility of AAPI identities and stories. But on the other hand, it feels a little tokenizing and performative, right? So heritage is supposed to note, or it's supposed to denote an individual's like familial history and a sense of identity, but more and more in popular culture and events that are organized and in celebration of this month, we see heritage kind of becoming code for API homelands, or kind of a celebration of various ethnic identities, and this idea of like traditional API values. And so, emphasizing it kind of emphasizes the over there traditions rather than the over here lives and histories. So, rather than focusing on understanding the complicatedness of diasporic identities, I feel like this month can sometimes emphasize these outsiders Orientalist perspectives of AAPI folks, which leaves, not a lot of space for celebration of how we are and who we are and how we got here, which I think is the intention, right, of this month. But, on a more positive note, I do feel that this month gives us additional opportunities to have platforms like this that can kind of promote works socially. And like, I think that platforms like this can have the opportunity to, let us promote works that are socially and historically conscious. That's what I was trying to say. But yeah, we just have to be actively aware of how we're racialized in the US so that we can work towards a more like nuanced understanding of our various identities. So it's a mixed bag for me.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And what about you, Lisa Park? Or Professor Park, my apologies.
That's fine. You can just call me Lisa, it's fine. Yeah, so I'm Korean American. I am considered 1.5, right? I was born in Korea, or in South Korea. And I came over to the United States when I was 7 with my family. So I grew up largely here in the United States. In terms of, it's kind of funny to be asked this question, how has it influenced the person you are today? It is who I am today. It is who I am yesterday too. So it's a strange question. And I sat there with it for a minute going, what am I going to do? Because I've never kind of teased it apart, right? It's just me. So there's that. Sorry, that's my answer for that one. And then in terms of the second part of the question, which is, what is this, specific month, right, designation mean? And I appreciate Tiffany's point here, in that, I don't think it means that much to me. I mean, not that I do appreciate that there's some recognition, but that recognition, assumes our invisibility as well, right? Or lack of visibility, I should say, right? In other parts of the month, or just in general. And I think that's also true. So, I do take that seriously. It is important to be reminded or to remind others sometimes. All right, so I think that's it for me in terms of this question. So we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually love your answer. It really is about visibility. And that actually kind of leads to my next question. The Asian Pacific American Council designated this year's theme as Advancing Leaders Through Collaboration. If you could tell us one story of an Asian American or Pacific Islander who exemplified positive leadership, what would it be? Or what stands out for you as a particular triumph or achievement within this community? And Professor Park, I know you just spoke, but I want you to start us off.
Okay, thank you. No, I'm happy to. So, okay, so I'm gonna be a bad participant once again and kind of answer your question in a way that you did. It's hard to come up with one, right? So I had a really hard time. So I was gonna quickly just squeeze in a couple. I wanted to do a shout out and say that in terms of Asian American or Asian Pacific Islander leadership, we don't have to look that far, right? We can look right on our campus. And I want to acknowledge the amazing work of the UCSB Pan Asian Network, right? This is a group of that was led by undergraduate students who are Asian American undergraduate students here at UCSB, and they formed in 2019. And they got us as in Asian American undergrads, graduate students, staff, and Asian American faculty to come together to think about the needs of our students and other community members on our campus, and to meet with, and they created a whole list of demands, and they sat down with Chancellor Yang and with EVC Marshall and Margaret Klaun, the ABC. And it was kind of a remarkable moment to see that kind of level of leadership, which was collaborative, which was, but also persistent and really effective, and just an incredibly hardworking group. And that was pretty amazing. And so there's that. I also wanted to also acknowledge, there are, of course, nationally amazing scholars, activists, and others who are doing pretty amazing work as leaders, right? And one person that comes to mind is Ai-jen Poo, right, who is a labor activist, right, who has been fighting on behalf of domestic workers for years, and healthcare workers, health aides, as well as childcare workers. And what I love is that respect about Ai-jen Poo is that, she fights on behalf of all the, this huge group of workers and laborers. And my goodness, if we don't, certainly during this recent, within our current moment of COVID, how important this group of workers are to this country and to many others, I think. And the fact that she's fighting on behalf of all of them, and of course, many of whom are Asian immigrant and Asian American, right? So that kind of like coalescing around these issues that is about Asian Americans, but so much more as well. And we see how it's through the lens of the workers' rights of Asian immigrants, right, that we see the greater need for workers in general, right? So it is a deep connection, right, with not just Asian Americans, but to understand how important Asian Americans are, right, as part of the larger whole and as part of the United States, right? And I think that that is a lovely and important way to organize and to see us, right, as part of them and all of us, right? Thanks.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Professor Park. And Tiffany, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, just to add on, first off, absolutely, yes. All of these, senior, for me, my heroes in the Asian American communities that are doing work that has truly changed me in my life are people like Lisa and Professor Huang, who are, professors teaching Asian American studies, who are, teaching us how to organize, teaching us that we can advocate for our rights, teaching us our histories and giving us space to grow as individuals, right? So for me, I did my MA at UCLA in the Asian American Studies department there. And, being in classes with people like Victor Bhaskara and who's a Phil-Am studies professor, and Lucy Burns and all of these other really incredible professors, really, that's what changed my life. Absolutely. Because before this, I was just like, bartending, and I was a professional dancer. I was just in performance, right? And then I was like doing what I needed to do to survive. But it was these kinds of scholars and professors that spent the time to collaborate with me, not only in my creative work, but like helping to build me as a graduate student, that really just, changed my life and is doing active good in the community, so that then we can give back to the community in addition. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And I also see a hand up, so I just want to remind everyone to put any questions in the chat and we'll get to them later. And Professor Huang, what are your thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, well, so my choice of a, of a leader in this regard is kind of obvious, but also surprising. It's actually Barack Obama, who was born in Hawaii, Pacific Islander, speaking of which. Well, if he can find the birth certificate, right? But I mean, jokes aside, he was really the first US president who acknowledged that the United States is a Pacific nation. And it took the United States over about, I would say 200 years to finally acknowledge that. And of course, we understand the history, the origin, the founding of the Republic. It's always transatlantic connection coming from England and European migration. And given the kind of cultural, ties between United States and Europe. And but if you look at American history throughout the 19th century and earlier, the westward movement is always toward the Pacific. Only when the United States, the movement reached the continental limit, and you see what some scholars will argue, the racial frontier, finally the European civilization is meeting up with the other side. And you can see the issues that rise with the Chinese, Angel Island, the Chinese immigration center, Japanese internment, but of course, Hawaii itself is a good example of that clash, what becomes, how things are racialized and what is called a spatial production. And Obama was really the first one because the Pacific was really deeply tied to the rise of the United States as an empire. And because the future of the United States literally, in the 19th century was lying in the West, not in the transatlantic connection. So Obama was really the first one to acknowledge the legacy, how important that was. So the other example I would say negatively, we always look for leaders, but on the other hand, there are some, community leaders who actually bad examples, I would say. I mean, I can name like Elaine Chao, really, she's Chinese, but she was the Secretary of Transportation, I believe, right, during Trump's presidency. I mean, she was standing right next to Trump when he was saying about there are good people on both sides after Charlottesville. And she was smiling right there. And to me, that was really a stain on the Asian American resume, cultural resume for that. So we can speak of the good and also the bad. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Huang. And you actually started talking about what my next question was about to ask. I think it's really important to acknowledge the dark times as well as the triumphs. I think it's part of acknowledging the complexity of Asian American history. So my next question is for Professor Park. In the past 2 years since the pandemic started, there's been a rise in Asian American targeted hate crimes. What do you consider to be the other dark times in Asian American and Pacific Islander history? Do you think these are often left out when telling the stories of American history?
Right. So, yes, I mean, I'll just start off with that there have, of course, there's many holes, right, in the way that American history is articulated, well, certainly for within grade school, right? And this is why, and as we try to fill in those holes, we can see this uproar right now that we're having, right, about critical race theory, which is basically code for anything regarding race that would critique in any way or even acknowledge US as empire or white supremacy, right? So any kind of disruption, right, from that singularly and a misrepresentation of US history, right, is deemed not just difficult, but in some way, well, deeply troubling, right, by many. And so here we are, right? We see how we narrate our origins, right? And I use "our" in quotes, right? Because there's a particular kind of narrative that and how we articulate it, who gets to articulate it, what does it look like? It feels incredibly fraught, right? And it feels it feels like a very difficult moment right now. Because while we're of course enduring the physical kinds of, we as an Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in this country are enduring, it feels like an onslaught of physical violence, right? But that's just one fraction of the actual violence that's going on, right? And that's the violence of this, these kinds of, of based on white supremacy, right? And that could come in all sorts of ways, right? So when we think about, what do we consider to be other dark times in, Asian American history, or certainly Pacific Islander, that's a whole other level, right, of violence. We can think about state violence. We can think about, in terms of empire, we can think about, just Philippines alone, it would take, a lot of time, right? So, but I'm stammering just because, I think that we could list so many, but maybe that's not so helpful, right? Also, especially because we're in such a dark moment right now, right? That when we articulate those moments, I think it could feel so overwhelming, right? And it feels already overwhelming enough. I think about this. So instead, I think about this particular incident, and of course, there've been so many, right? But in 2021, right, just last year, there was a Korean small convenience store that was attacked, right? And this was in Charlotte, North Carolina, and somebody came in with, with an iron pipe and just smashed up their store. And they did so while calling out every name you could think of, right? And they, did considerable damage. And afterwards, in the reporting of what happened there, what I found so fascinating, or just heartbreaking, is that after that, that violent incident, right? And luckily the parent, it's a family business, and the parents that were there were not injured. However, the place was demolished and the store was demolished. And afterwards, apparently, strangers started to arrive at the store, right? One by one. And they started to give the owners, the first person who came by gave them soup. They had made homemade soup, brought it over to the store owners and offered it, right? Then a pizza delivery person shows up and says, here are some pizzas that somebody else ordered. Then somebody else came, and somebody else, these strangers came to as symbols, offering, right, just kind words, or the food, right, to show their feelings of, the fact that they're sorry, right? This is their form of apology, that our life is the way it is. And the owners said that they were more shocked by the outpouring of generosity than they were shocked at the violence that they experienced. They had actually braced themselves. They were getting ready, and they knew it was going to happen. And when it did, they were not surprised. Instead, what they were surprised by is the kindness that people showed. And that, I think about this story, right? That when we think about what are dark times, this feels so dark to me, right? That that we have come to sort of brace ourselves, right? And that this isn't just one moment in history, right? We don't have to look that far, right? We can think about yesterday, we can think about 9/11, of course, post 9/11 and the experience of South Asians, but certainly we have these huge moments, of course, during World War II, right, with Japanese Americans and their incarceration. We can look at Chinese exclusion, historically, right, back in the day, right? But at the same time, what I'm experiencing today, and as I think about this, it's not sort of one moment, right, or just singular kind of moment that has a beginning and an end. It feels like a history that flows. It feels like a history that doesn't end. right? That's not to say it's all of pain and suffering either, by the way, right? But that it is always it was never an easy experience, I think, for Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. It has ebbed and flowed over time, right? And it is a continuation of our history.
Thank you so much, Professor Park. I actually got kind of emotional listening to you, especially because I took your class, your Asian American history class, and I heard of all of it. Well, not all of it. There's so much more. We could have had that class go over 3 years long, I'm sure, but I thought back at everything and I got emotional, but thank you so much. And I now have we're going to change the pace a little bit now. I have a question for Professor Huang. You wrote the book Charlie Chan, The Untold Story of the Honorable Detective and His Rendezvous with American History, based on the 1930s detective series. The character Charlie Chan is often seen as racist caricature playing off of East Asian stereotypes. Why did you choose to write about him? Oh, Professor Huang, I think you're muted.
Yeah, following Lisa's very kind of excellent, passionate, emotional speech, I thought we'll turn the page a little bit to talk about humor. And of course, the humor is about what? At whose cost, right? Who's the butt of the joke? In some ways, so Charlie Chan became an interesting example for me. It's sort of like a key to our understanding American culture. And one thing I really appreciate, coming from China and having lived here for a long time, is that humor is always a very important part of American culture, including racial humor. And especially when you look back at blackface minstrelsy, in the 19th century, and America used to be a very boring country, a Puritan country. And most of the Europeans who have visited the United States in the 18th century, they would say how dreary, how boring, because of the Puritans, blue law and very little entertainment. And in the 19th century, the rise of blackface minstrelsy and really the beginning of mass entertainment for the United States. And of course, it's very racist. But I come to understand, for instance, so it's inseparable to some ways. You cannot separate, like, to use a cliche, a baby from the bathwater in some ways. In order to understand how American culture and aesthetics came about, you need to understand how race plays into that. And so as a cultural historian and as a writer, the reason I wrote about Charlie Chan, not just because it's funny and but I fully understand the legacy, the racist legacy Charlie Chan embodies. I really want to kind of untangle what is the cultural matrix of America, which is humor. All right. So let me give you an example. For instance, given all the damage that Trump presidency had committed to this republic, to me, as Seinfeld said, as a comedian, the biggest offense that he got rid of the White House correspondent dinner. All right, he could not stand that because he could not stand a joke or a joke at his cost. And fortunately, Biden just reinstalled that this year. So because to me, that really represents it's what is so precious about a democracy is that that a president can invite a comedian, to make fun of him, and this is something, as Trevor Noah says this year. Imagine this happening in North Korea and China. It's not possible, and so for that, I think humor is a good medicine in some ways that keeps somehow a society healthy. And so for that reason, I want to kind of, look at what the past was. We cannot, deny the racist elements in literature, in art, and all that. But that's how American culture came about, and so we kind of had to be honest about the past, and that's really the main motivation for me to write about this very problematic character.
Thank you so much, Professor Huang. And I also have a question for Tiffany. on a similar, well, sort of on a similar note, we were talking about popular culture and media and art. On a similar note, has there been Asian American and Pacific Islander works of literature or media that have resonated with you lately that you wish to recommend to us?
Oh yeah, you came to the right person for this
Give
one.
us all of them.
Okay. Yes. So, okay. So first off, there are lots of Asian American folks and, API folks making, great art and whatever else out there. These are just my personal favorites. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention a bunch of other Cambodian Americans that I find are awesome, right? So starting with music, I highly recommend you listen to Ruby Ibarra, right? So Ruby Ibarra and the Bali Bakyans, especially there's a song called Us. That song's incredible. If you're into, the kind of like more dance pop music, Satika is a Cambodian American artist. She has this song called Ode to LBC that is really great on the topic of this month. And then I really like this Vietnamese American pop artist named Thuy, who actually came and performed here at UCSB recently, which was fun. And then of course, Surija, Surrija, if you plan to look it up. And I am also a performing artist. So you guys can, if you're interested, you can look at my album. It's called Cambodian Child, and the full album came out in 2020 by Tiffany Lytle. And then in terms of theater, Christina Wong's Sweatshop Overlord is amazing and is a finalist for a Pulitzer, which is very exciting. And Vichet Chum is Cambodian American and has a piece coming out in Chicago with Steppenwolf, which is called Bald Sisters. I'm just going to keep going. In the art world recently, I just saw this exhibition called Household by Tita Whitney Leck. That was for the first time I really, it's been a long time since I've really felt something like looking at art, especially I don't know, some art by, like paintings and things like that. Sometimes I'm just kind of like, yeah, but I've seen it before done by a bunch of other people. But this particular artist, Tita Whitney's work is really moving, and it really reminds me of home and growing up Cambodian American in Long Beach, and her attention to detail and the kind of the magic that's in those pieces. It's so beautiful. And in lit, of course, I've got to highlight After Parties by Anthony Viesnaso. And if you're into poetry, Maider Vang, who's Hmong American, has 2 collections of poetry that are amazing, Afterland and Yellow Rain. And then if you're into influencers, please, for the love of everything, check out Papaya Petite. Papaya Petite, she's on TikTok and she's on Instagram. Her work essentially is highlighting her family's legacy of making vegan Lao food, but she's also just got the hair, the makeup aesthetics, the home decor aesthetics. It's beautiful, beautiful. For film, if you haven't seen the half of it by Alice Wu, you have to. It's one of the few Asian Am films that's not doing some kind of Orientalist, thing. And then for TV, Pen 15, if you haven't seen it. Yeah, and last but not least, for fashion and jewelry, if you guys are into that kind of thing, check out Ada Chen Jewelry, and Rajana Threads is a Southeast Asian American company that I really love. So I know that was a lot. But I felt like, I had to give all of these different amazing artists some shout out, because it's been a long time, I feel like, especially with COVID, since I've really loved things, and so the things that I have loved have really stuck in my head.
Thank you so much. I was actually taking notes as you were speaking. You just kept them coming and I kept taking notes.
You can take my pop culture class and I would
probably love it. And sometimes we have questions in the chat. Today we don't, but Nomi actually had some questions for you guys. So I'm going to open the floor to my advisor, Nomi Morris.
Okay. Yeah, I teach journalism and writing in the writing program. And so my students do articles, and I had a fascinating article by one of my students who was actually questioning the whole term Asian American and how sweeping it is. There are so many different, this is a huge area from China to India to, we could go on about it. As somebody whose international specialization was the Middle East, I can remember being sort of like always correcting people. Oh my goodness, there's zillions of ethnicities and you can't lump everybody into the same pot. So I'm just wondering if our panelists have any response to that. On one hand, this is an opportunity with this Heritage Month, at least to shine a spotlight on some of these groups, but is there something problematic about that at the same time? Is this term Asian American inadequate? I don't care who answers it. Katie, do you want to try directing it?
Yeah, Professor Huang, start us off.
Okay, so I teach Gertrude Stein, who is a Jewish lesbian writer. And she's very fond of pronouns. And my students are, in the beginning, were all very confused because, she kept using pronouns, someone, anyone, everybody. She wrote a book called Everybody's Autobiography, and because she's sort of like fed up with this kind of self-identification, right? And so she ran away from labels. And as a Jewish lesbian interwar in Europe, being Jew and lesbian is basically you're done. And so there's a reason, I think, a simple, straightforward explanation why she ran away from labels. And because the labels pin you down, as you say, problematic, Asian American. Am I Asian American? Earlier I said I'm Chinese and American. Yes, I'm Chinese American, Asian American, but I look at myself as Chinese and American because that's how, so I think labels are mostly for others, but I also want to emphasize, I think, especially in this moment, and but also look back at history in terms of interracial violence, between Asians and African Americans and all that. So one year, for instance, when states like Alabama, Georgia, those are southern states, about 10 years ago, were passing these laws basically to crack down, to drive out illegal migrant workers, basically. And they just, for some reason, just out of the blue, they pass all these laws, crackdown. If you are to give an illegal immigrant a ride, then you're in trouble. So don't pick them up from the road. So that year I wrote in a New York Times op-ed piece describing my own hitchhiking experience in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, when I first arrived in the United States, fresh out of college. And I always, I have no problem carrying a Bible, on Sunday morning. People would stop for me, like, what church are you going? And I always say yours. And I ended up going to many because I didn't care. I was just curious about, American culture at the time. But I got a lot of responses, that people pointed out very correctly that if I were Black, nobody would stop for me in Tuscaloosa. But I was a stranger, right? Like Chinese. And yellow at the time was sort of like invisible color at the time in the South. And so that made me think of this kind of the importance of self-identification, by given the complexity, the darkness of the time, given that, once again, thinking about Buffalo and all that, sometimes it's more important to emphasize, this kind of coalition, right? Collective kind of coalition, because as a minority, you are in some kind of very special position, but the other minority groups oftentimes share the same, injury as well. So I think it's important to compare notes and to understand, the problem with the system of the structure, and not always particularly looking at from your own standpoint. And I think that's kind of something I want to emphasize, really. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we're just about out of time. I know Tiffany has an event shortly, so I don't want to take us over. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank our three panelists who made time out of their day to be here with us. I personally learned so much, and I think everything we discussed is so important, especially not just during this month, but year round, all the time. It's important conversations to be having. And I also just, while we were discussing, I felt so grateful to be moderating this event and asking the questions that our intern team compiled. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.